Coburg, and I'm part of the Philosophy and Literature program. Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Strain, of course, for putting on the conference that happens every other year. I really appreciate it as a first-year student, and of course, learning everything from them has been great, so thanks, guys. All right, so first of all, well, I guess second of all now, it was really nice meeting you all last night and having insightful and, of course, comical conversations. I really enjoyed it, even about banjo music. That was surprising, but really great. So the first speaker today is Abubakr Kahn. He's from Pakistan originally. He's a Fulbright scholar, and he's been at Binghamton University for 3 years now, and that's, of course, a branch of the SUNY system. And he's interested in 19th and 20th century continental philosophy. Of course, you've got Nietzsche, of course, and Heidegger, and Foucault, and Deleuze, sorry, I almost slipped in Derrida. So he's here and he's going to be speaking to us about laughing at one's wounds, Nietzsche, cheerfulness, Heiterkeit in German, and existence. Abubakr Kahn.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. It has been an honor to be here, and I have really enjoyed all the talks. And I did not enjoy the walk here. I'm not used to this cold at all. And well, the topic has to do with existence and tragedy and the possibility of laughing at one's, well, tragic existence. So while I was walking here, I was, of course, not happy with what Nietzsche had said about, facing one's wounds. I did not want to be affected by this cold at all. It was terrible. Okay. So the title of my paper is Laughing at One's Wounds, Nietzsche, Cheerfulness, the German word for this is Heiterkeit, and existence. Insofar as we exist, we always find ourselves in a world imprisoned by ideals and values that existed before us. This, indeed, is the impression one gets when one begins to read Nietzsche. It might be said, then, that Nietzsche would agree with a particular insight of Hegel's, ironically enough, that existence itself is like a wound, or at the very least, that it gives us wounds. A significant part of Nietzschean analysis thus involves the severe criticism of so many value systems of thought, and so many philosophers and philosophies, and indeed theologies that preceded him. Plato, Aristotle, the Vedanta doctrine, Hobbes, Rousseau, Kant, Schopenhauer, the list goes on and on. Some he has criticized very explicitly, others he's done so in a thinly veiled manner. It is no wonder then that one can often sense a very bitter tone in his text. It sounds melancholic at times, it sounds almost bemoaning, and as if you were lamenting everything that has existed prior to you, everything that you have been thrown into. And therefore, in Across Is Over, one finds many proclamations in regard to the tragedy of existence, such as, existence in itself is something very terrible. I just faced that right. In existing, one is wounded not only by ideals and values that have existed before us, but the mere fact of being alive also brings physical suffering. And yet, it is also with Nietzsche that one learns to laugh at the wounds of existence. It is important then to understand, and this is what I'm going to be doing in the context of this paper, how he can posit cheerfulness in the face of the tragic question of existence and the serious question of knowledge. In Nietzsche's work, one finds a reevaluation of laughter. The German word is lachen, and of course, cheerfulness, which links to this kind of laughter. Now, most religionist philosophies have hitherto, or before Nietzsche at least, frowned upon laughter, frowned upon cheerfulness as something that's frivolous. So, Nietzsche, well, takes on this task of revaluing happiness, revaluing laughter in a way that was not done before. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "Perhaps it is that, when nothing else from today has a future, our laughter is the one thing that does." Quotation marks closed. In the same text, he criticizes those philosophers such as Hobbes, who gave laughter a bad reputation among all thoughtful people. So, these were those people who proclaimed laughter as a terrible infirmity of human nature, and one that every thinking mind will endeavor to overcome. So, at the same time that he chastises Nietzsche, at the same time that he criticizes the masquerade of seriousness in regard to epistemology, Nietzsche also invokes Heidegger to counter nihilism, guilt, despair, so that he is also concerned with the existential question that emerges in the context of laughter and tragedy. Rather, for Nietzsche's Zarathustra, laughter is not frivolous. It cannot be associated with this mere meaningless, emotional in the sense of being overcome or being the opposite of rationality that's more superior to it. It is something else, and therefore Nietzsche, in this book Zarathustra, clearly writes, laughing is divine. And in section 294 of Beyond Good and Evil, he apotheosizes those who are capable of golden laughter. And he points to a new and superhuman way of laughing at the expense of everything serious. So till now, I'm just trying to get a sense of how Nietzsche was concerned with a certain revaluation of laughter. And of course, this has ontological and epistemological significance, in the sense that it concerns our ways of being and becoming, and our ways of knowing and not knowing, and also in the sense that it overturns ontology and epistemology as they were previously conceived. Now, of course, the point about the tragedy of existence is nothing new. A lot of philosophers, a lot of religions have actually, there's been a lot of analysis, a lot of thought on the idea that human existence itself is perhaps like a wound, perhaps like something that you cannot escape. But Nietzsche's response to this tragedy is very different. It's very different from those philosophers who try to purge us of our wounds and our pain, who try to separate us from our bodies, which are always at the mercy of being pierced by the world and its other forces. And therefore they do this by dreaming up either a perfect other world, or they dream up forms of transcendent ideas, pure a priori realities, or disembodied minds, just to get our human existence, our human thinking away from our corporeality. Thus, we must also consider Heidegger, cheerfulness, in the light of Nietzsche's critique of not just existence but also knowledge. He writes in Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, "We have grown sick of that bad taste, that will to truth at any price." Thus, he ridicules the obsession with certainty and truth on the part of philosophers, their self-aggrandizement, and their claims about having discovered the foundation or center of all that can be known, and how it is to be known. Philosophers who take themselves too seriously, these philosophers bear the brunt of Nietzsche's work, although he does take himself too seriously, of course. So, Nietzsche criticizes those who divorce laughter from thought, those who believe that where laughter and cheerfulness are found, thinking is good for nothing. Those cold and gloomy machines of the intellect, the philosophers, for whom knowledge is always a matter of taking the matter seriously. So that knowledge just has to do with seriousness. Well, why are we having this conference? So, in section 24 of Beyond Good and Evil, he mentions Heidegger des Lebens, which is the joy of life, or the cheerfulness of living, and links this to the will to not knowing, and the will to uncertainty. Again, he's trying to link laughter to another way of not only our experience, but our way of knowing. And thus, Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, And knowledge itself may be for others something different. For example, a better feast, or the path to a better feast. For me, it is a world of dangers and victories. Life as a means to knowledge. With this principle in one's heart, one can not only be brave, but can even live joyfully and laugh joyfully. This is actually very, very important in terms of the analysis that will follow. This link between life and laughter and corporeality. And this idea of how the world as we experience it is fraught with dangers and risk. And therefore, in the light of his critique of previous ontologies and epistemologies, we come across this new notion of Heiterkeit and laughter. And it is here that laughter billows out from the depths and brings out these structures, casting its colorful shadows over the tragic and the serious of life. But this laughter, and this is very, very important, does not ignore our pain. It makes our pain our own pain. As we proceed, it will become clearer how cheerfulness is always strung to our pain and our ability to suffer. So cheerfulness, or joy in the Nietzschean sense, is very different from happiness as it was conceived previously. It is not a happiness strung to a rationality which eviscerates or overcomes desire or passion. For instance, in the case of the Stoics, who believe that the good life, the life of virtue, freedom, and happiness, is a life free from passion. Neither is it the happiness of ethical philosophies that either make the aim of morality happiness or relate it to morality in some manner. It is surely very, very different from the utilitarian definition of happiness as well, the simple conception of pleasure without pain. And it is definitely not the Kantian conception of happiness, which is defined in the Critique of Practical Reason, as the state of a rational being in the world, in the whole of whose existence, everything goes according to his wish and will. In other words, happiness as getting what you want. Now, as we proceed, it will become clearer how for Nietzsche, happiness does not have to do with getting what you want. You can never get what you want. In fact, being cheerful in the sense of Heiterkeit is a sign of greater health only because you don't get what you want. For the moment, let's briefly turn to the Stoics. Nietzschean thought indeed draws on some aspects of Stoicism. A lot of scholars have actually written about this, such as Martha Nussbaum, I think. However, he clearly rejects any ideals of flourishing that require freedom from passion, freedom from the affects, freedom from desire, freedom from the senses. So that notion of rationality or rational understanding, which would be required to free us from our bondage to passive effects, that kind of an ideology does not make sense to me. This strategy of deadening the senses does not work, therefore, because it leads to the impoverishment of life. Nietzsche writes in Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, to this day you have the choice, either as little displeasure as possible, painlessness in brief, or the other choice, as much displeasure as possible, as the price for the growth of an abundance of subtle pleasures and joys that have rarely been relished yet. Stoicism, in denying value to the senses, to passion, also denies what is important. What is important for Nietzsche, of course, for our health and strength, namely our affectability, our openness, our ability to feel pain, our ability to suffer, and thus our ability for cheerfulness amid pain and suffering. Thus, according to the Stoic ideal, there is a negative evaluation of our capacity to be affected. Whereas with Nietzsche, we come across a positive affirmation of this very ability, this very capacity to be affected. And just as he was severely critical of the Stoic strategy to escape pain and suffering, Nietzsche also wrote about how Plato suffered from a fear of overpowerful senses, which is very interesting. He accused Spinoza, Plato, and a lot of other philosophers of a desensualization of this human spirit. He accused them of vampirism, of draining us of our blood, of peeling away our skins, of metasurgically removing us of our organs, of exorcising us from our visceral existence so that we maybe exist only as ghosts. But Nietzsche, on the other hand, urges us to employ the power of the passions, of the affects, of desires. He writes, those impetuous currents of the soul that are so often dangerous and overwhelming. Quotation mark close. This, of course, will always be fraught with danger and risk. Living in our bodies brings the possibility of pain, of being pierced, of passing through the skin that is not just a matter of corporeality, but indeed it is also our minds and bodies, our souls and our minds that are also being pierced. This is what it means to exist in the only way we can exist. In the words of Nietzsche, therefore, we must constantly give birth to our thoughts out of our pain. Thus, cheerfulness now seems to be something very different, because it cannot be free from this idea of corporeal existence. It cannot be free from passion. It is nothing if not passion. And we cannot rid ourselves of our desires, our drives, and our affects. They make us what we are, and they make us what we become. So, to sum up this section, happiness cannot depend on the rational conquest of our desires for needs. It cannot be happiness which severs us from our bodies and the immanent world where life happens. And therefore, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, happiness should smell of the earth and not of contempt for the earth. This new sense of happiness corresponds to what I have been calling cheerfulness, of course. Such happiness, such a way of living, belongs to the divine ones, which is precisely the title of the portion of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which I just quoted from. Laughter as divine. So again, laughing in and with our bodies means that we can never laugh over our pain. Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I pray you to laugh more, to laugh beyond yourselves, to raise your hearts, dance higher and higher. Never forget how good laughter is. I'll show you this crown of laughter, this crown of roses. I proclaim the holiness of laughter. Quotation mark close. Now, roses, of course, have thorns. So, one cannot avoid being pricked, because one is already, always, inexisting, open and bare, capable of being pierced. Our pierceability, it might be said, is an existential given. Thus, one cannot avoid thorns, and especially if one wants to catch this crown of roses that Nietzsche really wants to throw at us. Laughter thus is always communicated with pain. And this is why he disparages stoicism, of course, because it undervalues pain, stimulation, and suffering. It was actually interesting because when I was thinking about how whenever I read Nietzsche, I think about how what if my parents had read Nietzsche? So there's parts of it which is kind of like, really kind of propagating suffering. I'm like, thank God my parents did not need that, which is kind of interesting too. But then there's other parts that have taken the other way as well. So to continue with this link that I'm making between laughter and pain, of course, suffering is another very, very important element in this. And laughter cannot come contrary to suffering. It comes with it. And cheerfulness in this sense does not blind us to our suffering. It is with Nietzsche that we learn that the weak are not those who suffer, but those who cannot suffer. Those who fear suffering, or run away from it, or close their eyes in the face of approaching danger and calamity. Those who cannot take on suffering as their own. Those who cannot experience pain as their own. And why is that? Because pain and suffering necessarily come with life. Again, the importance of life, of living for Nietzsche. And therefore he's going to speak a lot about heroic spirits that have the power of dealing with these torrents of suffering, pain, or desires it affects, either from outside or within them as well. Now I think there's a lot of repetition because I'm trying to really pin down the connection between laughter and suffering and pain, so I'm going to skip through some of this. But there are some very important quotations from various Nietzschean texts. For instance, when he mentions that it is the deeply wounded who have Olympian laughter, and therefore it is heroic spirits who experience suffering as a pleasure. And then, really interestingly, he actually pins down this connection, this unbreakable connection between suffering and laughter and cheerfulness by writing, "Perhaps I know best why man alone laughs. He alone suffers so deeply that he had to invent laughter. The unhappiest and most melancholy animal is, as fitting, most cheerful. And thus, laughter is existentially significant for what he calls the most suffering animal on earth. Us, all of you. It is only if one has traversed the shadows, the abysses of illness, pain, mistrust, suffering, that one can be cheerful in this new matter." He writes in The Gay Science, "From such abysses, from the illnesses of severe suspicion, one returns newborn, having shed one's skin, with a more delicate taste for joy, with a more tender tongue for all good things, with merrier senses, joyful with a more dangerous second innocence, more childlike, and at the same time, 100 times more subtle than one had ever been before." In parts of the Middle East and South Asia, there is this saying, which goes something like this: "Whoever laughs too much will cry as much in the future." We were always told this when we were, being very boisterous with our fellow boys, fellow in our groups, but the Nietzsche reply to this would be, "I wish I had known this at the time." So what? Our laughter, our pain, our wounds, and our tears, all is life. So life to us, and this is Nietzsche again, means constantly transforming all we are into light and flame, and also all that wounds us. We simply can do no other. Nietzschean. Little Nietzschean out there. Right. This translation I've taken from the Kaufman translation, but I was not extremely happy with the way he used the word wounds here. What Kaufman translates as wounds here as a word is the German word triftig, which means to be struck by or to be affected by. Of course, Kaufman has taken some creative license, which is fine. But to broaden our understanding of what he's trying to say, what Nietzsche is basically arguing is this: we cannot escape that which affects us. We cannot escape, therefore, our wounds. We cannot escape that which faces our bodies and minds alike. And therefore, in the same section, Nietzsche will go on to write, "Only great pain is the liberator of spirit." So again, for Nietzsche, openness towards pain and suffering is necessary. And this is actually related to the Nietzschean conception of health, of strength and of health too. Because if you think about the Stoic ideal, or even any other philosophy's ideal of ridding yourself of your pain, ridding yourself of your senses and your desires, Nietzsche actually pronounces this as hostile to life. And therefore he will invoke a new health. This is precisely how he terms this. That is stronger, craftier, tougher, bolder, and more cheerful than any previous health. Only great pain makes one put aside all trust in the truth of all that we are given from before. Such mistrust is essential for those who seek a new dawn. Philosophers of the future, of course. Nietzsche was very much concerned with this idea of philosophers paving the path to the future. Of course, cursing every other philosopher that came before them. But so the trust in life is gone. Life itself has become a problem. Yet, one should not jump to the conclusion that this necessarily makes us sullen. Even the love of life is still possible. Only one loves differently. This was Nietzsche. And therefore Nietzsche continues, the attraction of everything problematic is so great that this delight flares up like bright embers again and again over all the distress of what is problematic, over all the danger of uncertainty. ... we know a new happiness. And this is the divine happiness full of power and love, full of tears and laughter. This was Nietzsche again. I'm going to move on to an aphorism that was published in Die Wissenschaft, in which he defines lacking, which is laughter, as follows. Laughter is schadenfroh, but with a good, clear conscience. Such laughter is therefore beyond good and evil. It is good only insofar as it can accept that it is also evil. It is schadenfroh, again, and thus Heiterkeit, in the way that we are trying to make sense of it right now, is related to schadenfreude, which is typically understood as taking delight in the pain or misfortune of others. Thus, in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche writes, I pulled away the curtain from the wickedness of man. However, there is perhaps another way of looking at this, which, at least to my knowledge, is being ignored by most commentators. If we shift the point, this preceding point, to the relationship of self to self, it allows us to consider how for Nietzsche it is important to take delight in one's own pain, to laugh at one's own wounds. And thus it is perhaps with the help of a certain interpretation of Nietzschean will to power as asubjective, as impersonal, that one can understand how, more than being a matter of one subject laughing at another subject's pain and object suffering, it concerns a pain that is ours, that has no place in one body or one soul, that cannot be placed, but rather flows in between, ever in between. And therefore, I'm going to take you back to what Nietzsche wrote. I pray you to laugh more, to laugh beyond yourselves. Thus, laughter takes us beyond ourselves, beyond the subjective and personal. It is individual and immediate and instinctive only insofar as we are always thrown out of our bubbles of individuality. Laughter does this when you laugh. It's like throwing yourself out. You find yourself somewhere else. But then, of course, you have to come back to it. Construed in this manner, under the light of Nietzsche's conception of will as that which is neither mine nor yours, but that which nevertheless flows in and with us, laughter, like the wind when it rushes out of the mountain crevices, this is another Nietzschean motif, takes us away from the tragedy of a self-enclosed existence, qua self-defining consciousness. And it takes us away from taking the subject seriously as well. So to sum, what we have unraveled in terms of the ties between cheerfulness and suffering, Heidegger's one must correspond to corporeality, to the corporeality of existence. And therefore, it requires a coming to peace which is never thus chaotic in some sense, of course, this is Nietzsche, with a being here, amid the numerous worlds and souls and bodies which constitute our life. It concerns, therefore, labyrinthine conflicts, struggles of the senses, arenas of effects, impulses, intensities, desires, and so on and so forth. Moving on to the conclusion, there is a laughter that one might associate with the no-saying strands of Nietzschean thought. You could call this a laughing act. A laughing act, hyphenated, which corresponds to the destruction of the ideals of today. This is important so that pre-existing ideals do not make us more miserable or continue to reign over us. In this sense, laughter has destructive potential. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, not by wrath does one kill, but by laughter. Hence, the destruction of previously held beliefs and values is very, very important for Nietzsche, and this requires a wickedness, a sense of cruelty. Such a laughing act must take into account such evil, as I've mentioned before, so that, at least in part, Heiterkeit corresponds to a cruelty, to taking pleasure in destruction. And this is interesting because this is when I wanted to cite Nietzsche in front of my parents when I was breaking toys in my My parents were, okay, don't do that. There should be joy in destruction, right? So, it is probably therefore that in Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, one can therefore sense a merry tone when Nietzsche announced that grand event, the death of God. But of course, if one takes this statement merely at face value, or as a slogan to adorn the front of t-shirts worldwide, it's ignoring the true depth of such a proclamation. Because God here stands for actually something much more. All gods, all possible gods, all ideals, all values, all divine ideas or unshakable ideals that appear as ultimate authorities and function as moral and epistemological centers. It is with Nietzschean cheerfulness that one turns away from passivity and fixity and rigidity, and therefore that one can learn to, quotation marks open, to play with everything that was hitherto called holy, good, untouchable, divine, quotation marks closed. And it is only with such a no-saying, a laughing act, that what Nietzsche calls the great seriousness, the gross ends, really emerges. Which is actually very interesting. Because he is going to, this is what Nietzsche does with almost every single term. He's going to refer to it in the context that it was previously used. Then he's going to redefine it and give it another sense. And of course, it's a way of kind of flowing between different opposites and trying to see how they fit as well. So actually, it is laughter that brings us to a seriousness that was greater than all previous seriousness that philosophy had hitherto clung to. Thus, he invokes Heidegger to disengage with and think beyond such ideas. Now, there's actually a dual action here, and this will become clear as we proceed. Because for Nietzsche, it is not just a matter of sneering at that which existed before us. It is not mere mockery. It is not mere destruction. It is always also to welcome the unknown future. This is how Nietzsche defines Dionysian wisdom. Quotation marks open. Joy in the destruction of the most noble and at the sight of its progressive ruin. In reality, joy in what is coming and lies in the future. So, on one hand, joy or taking delight in ruins. On the other hand, the future, which is made possible by these ruins. And therefore, he writes, we must be destroyers. And again, this is not mere destruction, as I just mentioned. This is also that which must pave the path to a yes-saying, a futural yes-saying. In section 343 of Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, he uses the motif of new dawn. And of course, any new dawn is contemporaneous with some sort of twilight. So, to be clear, there is also a cheerfulness which corresponds to saying yes to all of life, to amor fati, and the Dionysian affirmation of the world as it is. Nietzsche explains my new way to say yes, my new version of pessimism, as a voluntary quest for fearful and questionable aspects of beings. A pessimist such as that could in that way lead to a Dionysian yes-saying to the world as it is, as a wish for its absolute return and eternity. This is how, with Nietzsche, one could perhaps learn to bring the future and the past into the now, so that our laughter is imminent. One laughs here and now. It is thus neither the longing for a past, a golden age, nor is it the wistful hope of an ever-distant future. Rather, in the midst of this laughter, the past and the future join hands in the now. Earlier we had noted that for Hegel, existence is a wound but for Hegel, it is a wound which spirit, or Geist, itself can heal. And once it is healed, this leaves no scars. This is from the Phenomenology of Spirit, section 669. So, this idea of how in existing existence has given you a wound, but spirit itself will heal that wound, and in such a way that you will be left with no scars. For Nietzsche, however, our wounds are never stitched up, they are left open. So, cheerfulness is never a matter of our wounds healing, our pain being taken away, but a matter of learning to live in and with our wounds. So, to clarify again, no saying destruction is inseparable from the creative activity of yesterday. So, the two kinds of laughter are nevertheless co-imbricated. This, indeed, is a double-edged sword of laughter, as a destructive force and as that which heralds possibility. Hence, it is not only a matter of showing one's wounds, rather, it is also projecting forth into new, existential, epistemological, and political possibilities. With Nietzsche, therefore, we learn not only to laugh at, but also to laugh with. The question then is, with what? With life, of course. With not only the colors that play on its surface, but also its dark depths. Such laughter is golden because it does not evade or blind itself to human suffering. Rather, we must laugh at and with our wounds. This is the only remedy. And then perhaps our wounds, which we can never escape, will also laugh with us.
Perhaps I think is a more enjoyable way to start the day, into discussion of Nietzsche. So I'm pretty incredulous about people who view Nietzsche with a certain amount of Kantianism, like when the eternal returns juxtaposed to the categorical imperative, or when we think of critique in a Kantian sense. But nonetheless, I want to do a little bit of that. So if we, I guess, start with this physiological perspectivism, where our affectation is impacting our epistemological outlooks. You know, we're trying to open ourselves to more affectation, right? To feel more intensities of the passions. And we go down that road toward, I guess, a certain vitalism, right? And ultimately toward a will to power without a subject and a more fatigue. I'm wondering how different that is at the end than this sort of Kantian definition of happiness that you provided early on, where you sort of have a universal will that sees itself everywhere. So could you speak a little bit more about how those are incommensurate with one another?
Are you trying to point out the disconnection, or rather a possible connection between work part and the universal will? Is that your primary concern?
I'm trying to suggest there's a connection, but my ultimate motivation is that I like to separate Nietzsche from what it's worth.
Right,
so
right. No, of course.
Could you help me out?
No, of course, but also, look, again, Nietzsche is vast. He's written so much, and so much of it is so contradictory and contrary that you take out certain fragments and, just play around with those, and you can link it to a lot of different things. We were discussing this yesterday as well, the idea of the blonde beast and, taking the idea of the overman as somebody who imposes his will on others, right? And of course, these kind of conceptions there's no way to say that they would be wrong in any sense. So this tie to a Kantian conception of a super subject, perhaps, or a universal will, it could make sense in certain, if we, I guess, limit our scope to certain reading or certain fragments of Nietzschean thought, which is fine. But the important thing to consider then is this. When Nietzsche is talking about a certain conception of will, he at the same time is talking about individuals, but he's talking about that which is never, well, in our power as individuals. So there's always two things that he is doing at the same time, and it can be very, very confusing. But it shouldn't be. Why? Because the way that he sees the world, especially the Dionysian world that he thinks about, even if you don't think of it as impersonal or asubjective, in fact the subjectivity has just disappeared completely, it is still something that it concerns all of existence, or rather everything that ever was and ever will be. And he also talks about how maybe humans will be, our individuality will be superseded by something that comes after us. So there is this idea, if you take it in those terms, in terms of his overall bent towards something that is either overhuman or something like the undersoul, something that's simmering under the human, you kind of understand that you have to detach yourself from a very general or a very static idea of the will in the sense of Kantian. And it's actually because of these flows within Nietzschean thought that you can understand how even if it is possible to proclaim that there is such a thing as a universal will that Nietzsche is talking about, he's always disengaging it. He's always putting it elsewhere. And this is probably why, if you read all of Nietzsche, it becomes clearer why the will to power does not exist in me as an individual. Yes, I have some sort of a role to play in the way that I'm probably a vessel for this power to actually come across or carry its effects into the world. So, yes and no, I guess, but a certain flowing in between is probably the best way to think of Nietzsche. It's not just about chaos as well, it's not even the other side. It's not just about a complete destruction, a complete letting go of all values and everything like that. No, he's always talking about other possible worlds. He mentions this a lot, other possible worlds. Many tables of values. How is it possible for us to go towards the future? What will the gods be like in the future? All of these different things. So it will be simplistic, I guess, that kind of an idea. But in certain contexts, sure.
So it's interesting to hear you talk about Nietzsche in the context of the papers we've already heard, because like the Duraskin last night saying jokes, we're following one script and then we suddenly realize we've been doing another. Or Sophia with the duck rabbit, and the punchline gets us from the duck to the rabbit. Do you think it would be fair to say that transvaluation of values in Nietzsche functions in exactly the same way? It's kind of like a joke. It's the punchline. He wants us to see, we've been following this script, saying suffering is just, needs justifications, argument against existence. But then the punchline is the transvaluation of values, that he wants us to just see everything differently. It's the same world, but now we see it as a duck instead of a rabbit, or we see it in the yay saying laughter and not the no saying. Would that be you think, a fair assessment of the transvaluation? It's a joke structure.
It wouldn't be a fair assessment. It would be an interesting assessment. But yes, there are certain links. Because again, the way that I was trying to plot the map of this essay particularly had to do with, again, this idea of the no saying and the yes saying, and how there's something that perhaps flows in between and connects them in some manner. And I was also, while you were talking right now, and also last night, I was thinking about philosophers such as Deleuze who've spoken on the concept of paradox, about sense. And I think it was somebody who mentioned something about even humor has to do with playing on the surface of sense, surface concept, which is very interesting as well. Now, the surface for Deleuze is something that connects two very different realities, which are realities nonetheless. And therefore, this idea of actually how it connects one side, but also the other side. And of course, I'm taking a large leap by using that to answer your question, but the fact is, that's a Nietzschean idea too. Because you could focus on Nietzschean no saying, on this idea of destruction, of critique, of every single philosopher that preceded me was this. Every single value that preceded me was this. The aesthetic ideal, Christianity, Platonism, all of that. And so we're just in despair completely. But then, the other side of that is that amidst those ruins, there's the possibility of a future. And that's probably why we can laugh, because of that change, that aspect change that somebody was talking about yesterday. The fact that there's a shift. And the fact that there can always be a shift. You don't have to be rooted in just one kind of way of being. It's always two-pronged. It's always double-edged, like this laughter, perhaps. Would that make it something like a joke? Yes, maybe. Maybe in some sense it will. But I think a joke judge is very, very, very serious at the same time.
I think we'll have to cut it there.